Thank you, Your Honor. Your Honor, the state calls Johnny Mercil.
Yes, sir. Raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth and nothing but the truth?
Yes, Your Honor.
Have a seat, please.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You anticipate what I was going to ask you to do. If we could have you state your full name, spell each of your names.
Johnny Mercil, Johnnny. Mercil is Mercil.
Mr. Slisher.
Thank you, Your Honor. Sir, how are you employed?
With the City of Minneapolis Police Department.
Right? And what do you do for the city of Minneapolis?
I'm currently on medical leave, but I'm a lieutenant with the Minneapolis Police Department.
How long have you been with MPD?
Since 1996.
I'd like you to tell the jury a little bit about yourself first. Could you share your educational background?
Yes, sir. I got a 4-year degree from the University of North Dakota in criminal justice studies.
What year?
I graduated in 95.
And after you graduated from the university, did you get a job in law enforcement right away, or did you go elsewhere?
No, sir. I got hired from the Minneapolis Police Department in 1996 and joined the Minneapolis Police Academy.
Describe your academy experience.
I was a cadet, so we did a combination of the police academy along with college courses to qualify for the Minnesota post test.
Did you take and pass the post test? Your
Yes, sir.
Licensed peace officer?
Hold on a little bit so we don't talk over each other.
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, thank you.
Yes, sir.
All right. After you completed your coursework with the academy, did you go into a field training program?
Yes, sir.
How long were you in that program?
I believe it was about 4 months at that time.
Okay. And then you received your first assignment as a police officer, is that right?
Yes, sir.
Can you please tell the jury what your first assignment was? Where were you and what were your duties?
Yes, I was a patrol officer assigned to the 3rd Precinct, which is southeast Minneapolis. And duties are patrolling the streets, answering 911 calls.
Okay. How long did you serve as a patrol officer in the 3rd Precinct?
Initially for a couple of years, and then I went to the community response team, which is a plainclothes unit.
What is it's also referred the community response team? I've heard it called the CRT.
Yes, sir. CERT team.
CERT team. What does that do?
They respond to the local community's concerns about crime, prostitution, drug dealing, gang activity.
How long were you with the CERT team?
I did that for about 3 years.
And then what was your assignment afterwards?
From there, I went to the Mounted Patrol unit, and that was technically downtown unit at the time.
What does the Mounted Patrol unit do?
We patrol on horseback, mainly crowd control. For busy times in Minneapolis, we focused on bar close in downtown Minneapolis.
Yeah, how long did you do that?
Full time for about 1.5 years, and then I went to patrol in downtown Middle Watch, the precinct.
Okay. How long were you in the downtown Middle Watch assignment?
I was on downtown Middle Watch until 2006, and then I got promoted to sergeant.
In order to be promoted for sergeant, did you take an exam and pass it?
Yes, sir. It's a civil service exam along with an assessment center.
And after you were selected as sergeant, you received your first assignment?
Yes, sir.
What was that?
I went to the robbery unit in downtown here at City Hall. And then from there, I went to the juvenile unit. And then I eventually ended up back downtown on patrol as a supervisor.
Okay. And how long did that take? What year are we up to now?
Oh, I think we're at about 2007, 2008.
Okay. And after that?
I was there for a couple of years. I ended up going back to Mounted Patrol full-time as a sergeant in charge of the unit. That went through 2009. I went back to the street for about 1.5 years, and then I went to the Minneapolis Police Department's gang enforcement team as a sergeant.
Okay.
And then we, from there, I investigated gang crimes, gun crimes. And then after that assignment, I ended up on the north side on patrol for about 1 year, 1.5 years, and then I went back downtown as a sergeant on the community response team, the CERT team downtown. And then in 2017, I took the exam for lieutenant and passed and was a lieutenant in 2017.
And where were you assigned then as a lieutenant?
After I got promoted, I was transferred to the training division in charge of use of force.
I'd like you to talk to the jury a little bit about your own background in the use of force. You're familiar with the Minneapolis Police Departmental policy regarding the use of force?
Yes, sir. I trained for several years for that.
That was a part of your academy training?
Partially. You get to be familiar with the use of force through the academy.
And then after you left the academy, did you have to take refresher courses, which would have included use of force training every year?
Yes, sir.
In order to maintain your post license?
That's correct, sir.
Have you had training beyond that, beyond what was presented at the academy and your yearly certification?
Yes, sir.
Could you please describe it?
Yes, I became a part-time use of force instructor in about 2010, and I maintained that part-time status as a use of force instructor up until I was promoted to lieutenant, where I went to the training unit full-time.
What did you have to do to become qualified to be a use of force instructor?
Went through different courses designed to train us up on use of force. I also started training Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu for the department as part of our ground defense initiative. Several other classes in different academies I went through too.
And I'd like to maybe qualify a few terms, if we may. We've talked about use of force and use of force training. We also hear the term defensive tactics. Can you differentiate between the two?
I think they're interchangeable. I think use of force is probably the more appropriate term, but I think defensive tactics has been more of a term that's been used longer, so people tend to refer to use of force instructors as defensive tactic instructors.
Would a defensive tactics, in terms of defensive tactics instruction, include more hands-on type instruction? You'd mentioned Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, for example.
Yes, sir.
Right. Were you interested in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu before becoming a police officer, or how did that develop?
No, sir. I was in martial arts through college, and then I got interested in it from some of the other use of force instructors, kind of recruited me to do that, and really fell in love with the art form and really what its implications and uses are for law enforcement specifically.
Would you please just provide a very high-level overview of what Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is and some of its basic principles?
Yes, sir. It's a form of martial art that really focuses on leverage and body control, de-emphasizes strikes. In a true Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, there aren't strikes. There's no punching or kicking. It's using your body weight, kind of like wrestling, and joint lock, manipulation, neck restraints, things that, pain compliance as well as physical body control to get people to comply.
So you use that phrase, pain compliance. What is that?
Pain compliance is using a technique that causes the person you're using it against to have pain, so they comply to your whatever it is you're asking them to do.
So if we were to use an example maybe from childhood, you're familiar with the game Mercy?
Yes, sir.
Right, where you lock fingers and twist down and then somebody has to submit. Is it similar to that?
Yes, sir.
All right. Although Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is not the only defensive tactic that officers at MPD are trained on, is it?
No, sir.
It's just one of a variety of different tools that can be employed to deploy force. Is that right?
That's correct.
For the purpose of enforcing the law, correct?
That's correct.
Then, as a use of force instructor, after you became certified, did you have to become knowledgeable in all the relevant departmental policies and procedures regarding the use of force, the 5-300 series?
Yes, sir.
As well as state law governing the use of force, which is largely integrated into Minneapolis departmental policy. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And you indicated that you were the lieutenant. You were a lieutenant over in the training center. Is that right?
Training division, sir.
Training division. And please describe your role then as a lieutenant in the training division.
Yes, sir. I was in charge of use of force. I was also in charge of our patrol operations section of training, as well as the police range. and I was in charge of all of our continuing education to make sure that our officers are fulfilling their post mandates to maintain their license to be a police officer.
And as part of that, to make sure that you're properly reporting to the post board, you keep records, sign-in sheets, and whatnot of particular officers having completed training. Is that right?
That's correct.
And those training hours are collected and reported into the Workforce Director program?
Yes, sir.
Right, so you have an accurate record of who's been trained in what. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And is it when you're the lieutenant of the training division with use of force, are you coordinating both pre-service and in-service training?
Yes, sir. The pre-service side would be use of force, the range, and patrol operations. The in-service side is what we consider to be the post mandates that we have to keep up with. That's the post-service side, in service.
And as a lieutenant, obviously, you're in charge of, you're in a position of rank over the sergeants. Is that right?
That's correct.
And those are usually the level. The trainers would largely be at the sergeant level. Is that right?
Mainly officers with some sergeants overseeing.
As the lieutenant and the person in charge of this training, are you familiar with the curriculum that is imparted upon both pre-service and in-service trainees?
Yes, sir.
You help develop the curriculum.
Yes, sir.
And do you approve the curriculum?
Yes, sir.
The curriculum could include, it does include just a general booklet that's put together by the defensive tactics instructors. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And that booklet contains the general concepts for use of force that are imparted on pre-service trainees and in-service trainees. Is that right?
That's correct.
If I could show Exhibit 126 just to the witness. All right, I'm showing you what's been marked for identification as Exhibit 126. It's labeled Minneapolis Police Department Use of Force Manual, Academics, and Techniques, produced by the MPD Defensive Tactics Team. Are you familiar with this document and its predecessor documents?
Yes, sir.
Does this document contain sort of the general curriculum and knowledge that's imparted upon MPD pre-service and in-service trainees?
Yes, sir.
Offer Exhibit 126.
126 is received.
And we won't publish that at this point. And do you also participate in and approve various classroom PowerPoint training sessions that are imparted upon both pre-service and in-service trainees?
Yes, sir.
And at this time, just to the witness, I would like to show what's been marked for identification as Exhibit 119. Exhibit 119 is a slide deck that's labeled 2018 Defensive Tactics in Service. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
If you could show the witness the second page. And do you see your name on the slide deck listed at the top of the instructors?
Yes, sir.
Are you familiar with the contents of this particular PowerPoint presentation or slide deck?
Yes, sir.
Did you help create it?
Yes, sir.
And you approved its use during the training, is that right?
That's correct.
And it's listed as fall of 2018, so this is what would have been provided for in-service training, so experienced performing officers during this 2018 session, correct?
That's correct.
And is the training that's provided, you have quite a few Minneapolis police officers who have to go through the training, right?
Yes, sir.
So they're not all taking it at the same time.
That's correct.
But if someone has completed the fall 2018 in-service defensive tactics training, does that mean that they saw this slide deck?
Yes, sir.
I'll offer Exhibit 119.
No objections.
119 is received.
And we talked about training records as well and sign-in sheets, and so I'd like to show the witness Exhibit 124. Exhibit 124 is labeled 2018 Annual In-Service Training Program Group B. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And I see your name at the top as one of the instructors, is that right?
That's correct.
This is a sign-in sheet that would show different officers who would sign in having taken the training.
That's correct.
Turn to page 2. Do you see the name Derek Chauvin on this training roster?
Yes, sir.
Are you familiar with that name, Derek Chauvin?
Yes, sir.
Chauvin, I'm sorry, Derek Chauvin. Do you would you recognize Mr. Chauvin if you saw him in the courtroom today?
Yes, sir.
Do you see him today?
I do, sir.
Would you please point to him and describe what he's wearing?
Yes, sir. He's got a dark blue tie, light blue shirt, and a gray jacket.
May the record reflect the witness has identified the defendant.
It will.
Go back to page 1. And at this time, I will offer Exhibit 124.
24. 124 is received.
Permission to publish 124. Right. If you could highlight the instructor block and title. All right, again, you see that this is the 2018, this training was provided on October 1, 2018, is that right?
Yes, sir.
And you are listed as one of the trainers, correct?
That's correct.
And if you could go to page 2 and highlight, please. And there you can see that the training was attended by the defendant. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
You can take that down. How many times do you think you've provided training like what we saw in the exhibit to various officers over the years?
Hundreds of times, sir.
And is this a slide deck that you identified as being the 2018 version fairly consistent with prior versions of the use of force training you've provided?
The documentation, sir?
Yes.
Yes.
So when you do use of force training, there are generally two components, right? There's a classroom component, and then there would be, more of the tactical component, practical exercises. Is that right?
That's correct.
And what we saw in the exhibit was the classroom component.
I believe so.
Okay. Well, what I'd like to do now is publish Exhibit 119. And just like you've done hundreds of times before, I'm going to have you explain some of the selected slides to the jury. All right?
Yes, sir.
All right. Please turn to page 2, 119. And again, you can see your name listed on this in-service training as one of the instructors. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And turn to page 4. Page 4 of the slide deck contains a policy reference. Is that right?
Yes, sir, it does.
And you testified that you're familiar with the policies, the use of force policies. One of the objectives of training is to impart the policies, teach those policies to the attending officers.
Yes, sir.
And so this is from the Minneapolis Policy Manual 5-301. Could you please describe to the jury what this slide is intended to convey?
Yes, sir. Looks like there's 3 bullet points. The first one is sanctity of life and the protection of the public. That is the cornerstone of our use of force policies is the sanctity of life and the protection of the public. Also, clear and consistent force policies. We like our policies to be easily understood. And then the use of force standards do fall under the Fourth Amendment reasonableness standard.
And since we're talking about use of force, I'd like to turn to page 7 of the exhibit, 119. When we talk about use of force, explain to the jury what is force.
It's listed on this slide here. Intentional police contact, involving any weapon, substance, vehicle, equipment, tool, device, or animal that inflicts pain or injury to another, physical strikes to the body, physical contact to the body that inflicts pain or injury, or restraint applied to manner or circumstance likely to produce injury.
So you train officers that restraint is a form of force, is that right?
Yes, sir.
And when applying force or applying restraint, the restraint has to be reasonable, correct?
Correct.
And it has to be reasonable at the time it starts and the time it stops?
Correct.
You're familiar with the concept of proportionality.
Yes, sir.
If you could turn to the exhibit page 8. When you discuss proportionality to trainees, you use this exhibit, is that right?
Yes, sir.
In general, without using the slide for a moment, just explain to the jury as you would a group of trainees, what is proportional force?
Well, you want to use the least amount of force necessary to meet your objectives, to control. And if those lower uses of force do not work, would not work, or too unsafe to try, then you can increase your level of force against that person.
You say do not work, would not work, or unsafe to try. It sounds like you maybe have used that phrase a time or two.
Yes, sir.
Is that a phrase that you've used in pretty much every training that you've given on use of force?
When there's a PowerPoint or we talk about use of force, we discuss proportionality regularly.
Okay. And you said that you want to use the least amount of force as necessary?
Yeah, yes, sir.
Why is that?
Because if you can use a lower level of force to meet your objectives, it's safer and better for everybody involved.
And when we talk about proportionality, is proportional to what?
I would say the level of resistance you're getting.
And the level of resistance would be dependent upon who?
The subject that you're using force upon.
The specific subject.
Yes, sir.
All right. At this time, I'm asked to publish Exhibit 110, and this is an item that's already been received into evidence. Do you recognize what's in Exhibit 110?
Yes, sir.
What is that?
Well, it's technically called the Defense and Control Response Training Guide, but a lot of people refer to this as a use of force continuum.
Okay. And when we were discussing the concept of proportionality, you talked about subject behavior. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Subject behavior is over here on the left-hand side, correct?
That's correct.
And the subject behavior can vary from, I guess, nothing, to passive resistance, all the way to active aggression, correct?
Yes, sir.
And then in terms of proportionality, there's various tools that are available to a law enforcement officer based on the subject behavior, correct?
That's correct.
And some of these tools, if we can just take an example with active aggression, one response could be what?
Up to and including deadly force.
But then for lower levels of subject activity, such as passive resistance, right, that could include things like presence and verbalization. Right?
That's correct.
And is this something that you use with law enforcement officers you train to sort of graphically represent the concept of proportionality?
I'm not sure if we've used this specific to proportionality of force, but we have used this in the past to describe, like, as levels of resistance increase, that officers' response and also increases.
And similarly, as levels of resistance decrease, what should the officer do?
You should de-escalate use of force as well.
And that's actually listed on this response and control guide, isn't it?
Correct.
If you would clear that, Your Honor. And you'd indicated that you train officers that they should use the least amount of force that is available or that's reasonable under the circumstances. Is that right?
To meet the objectives, yes.
And explain that.
So you want to use the least amount of force if you're trying to control somebody, might be a lower level of force than if you're trying to get them in handcuffs and they're fighting. So you want to use the lowest level of force possible in order to meet those objectives.
And lower levels of force, fair to say, when you're using force, people can get hurt.
Yes, sir.
The subject can get hurt, the officer can get hurt.
Yes, sir.
Is that one of the reasons why it's better to use a lesser amount of force?
Yes, sir.
And another reason is that it's required. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
If you could go back to Exhibit 119 and publish page 12. And you train this to officers. This is back to your training materials. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
The Minnesota statutes provide, and this is integrated into the MPD policy, the concept of minimum restraint. Is that right?
That's correct.
And I'd ask you if you could please highlight the first section. I'm sorry, the second section. All right. What does the policy and the statute provide regarding the amount of restraint that can be used on an arrested subject?
The first line talks about the officer making the arrest may not subject the person arrested to any more restraint than is necessary for the arrest and detention.
What does that mean?
Means the minimum amount of force that you need to accomplish the objective of arresting and detaining somebody is what you should use.
Now, you're familiar with the circumstances that bring you here today. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And I need to show you a photo that's been received into evidence, and it's Exhibit 17, if you'd like to publish that. Right. You see Exhibit 17, and you see the defendant on top of a subject that you know to be George Floyd. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Is this a use of force?
Yes, sir.
If you could take that down, please. I want you to discuss, in terms of using force and using it safely, what you teach your trainees about sort of the frailty of the human body. It's important to be careful with people, is that right?
Oh, yes. It's very, very important to be careful.
And there's some parts of the body that are more prone to injury than others, correct?
That's correct.
And you train on that, is that right?
Yes, sir.
If we could display Exhibit 119, page 49. Now, this is from strike training, is that right?
That's correct.
But is it generally helpful in describing what some of the more sensitive parts of the human body are as you train Minneapolis police officers?
Related to strikes, yes.
Could it be related to other types of restraint as well?
I think you could stretch that some. I don't know exactly how to. What's the question exactly again? I'm sorry.
Is it fair to say that the areas that are marked in red, the red zones, are more prone to injury than other parts of the body? That could be serious.
Yes.
So, for example, the neck
Yes.
and the head
Correct.
and the sternum of the chest. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And this wouldn't just pertain to strikes. It could also pertain to pressure, couldn't it?
Yes.
Is that something you probably knew before you even did any use of force training?
Yes, sir.
Well, I'd like you to then discuss with the jury the concept of neck restraints. And if we could publish it, page 52 of the exhibit. And looking at the time period that you were doing this training, neck restraints were authorized by MPD policy, correct?
Yes, sir.
Can you please describe the training that you provided to Minneapolis police officer regarding the use of neck restraints?
Yes, sir. We'd go over the techniques, definitions of neck restraints, and we'd go through different reps of the neck restraint to get the officers comfortable in doing it.
Could you just give the jury an overview of what a neck restraint is?
Yes, sir. So Neck restraint is constricting the sides of a person's neck, and they refer to it as a vascular neck restraint, so you're slowing the blood flow to and from the brain with the intent to gain control of a subject.
And there are two different types of neck restraints in the MPD policy, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And those are what?
The two levels are conscious neck restraint, so that means you've wrapped somebody up and they're still conscious, and you can gain compliance with many people with that. And then there's unconscious, and that's applying pressure until the person, when they're not complying, you put enough pressure that they become unconscious and then therefore comply.
How does one actually apply a neck restraint?
We teach a couple of different techniques, but the basic idea is you use your elbow as a landmark and you place your arm across. So your bicep would be on one side of the neck and your arm would be on the forearm on the other side of the neck. And then there's a couple of different hand placements, but then you apply pressure with head pressure on both sides of the neck to gain compliance.
And you were demonstrating, you were using your arm to do that.
That's correct.
And it'll also be done with the leg.
It can be done with the leg.
Does MPD train on how to do it with the leg?
We may show the younger officers in the academy what that looks like, but we don't train leg neck restraints with the officers in service. And as far as my knowledge, we never have.
How would a trained neck restraint work? I'm sorry, how would a trained leg neck restraint work?
People that watch MMA, so professional fighters, they call it a triangle choke, and I use that term choke loosely. That's just what it's called. But that's when you place your leg over somebody's back, across their side of their neck, and then you trap their arm in, so the person ends up having one arm in, and their arm causes pressure on one side, and the leg causes pressure on the second, and you can actually render somebody unconscious if you hold that long enough.
The what part of the leg?
Usually it's the inner thigh.
Inner thigh. So in this scenario, using a leg to do a neck restraint, would the knee sort of replace the elbow in terms of placement? Or how would you describe it?
I would say the knee doesn't really replace the elbow. Your thigh would be across the side of somebody's neck, your leg across their back, and you protect the airway really with the space that's created with their arm being pinned in there.
If you could please display the next page, page 53. Use of neck restraints. Can you describe, in using those concepts of proportionality, when it's authorized to use a neck restraint of the two different varieties?
Yes, sir. On subjects who are actively aggressive, which means assaultive, they're actively resisting and other techniques haven't worked, you can use it then. And then on the bottom it says no, that you can't use it against subjects who are passively resistant.
And if you could go to the next slide, page 54. And after a neck restraint is applied, there are certain guidelines that you train that have to be followed. Is that right?
That's correct.
For the care of the individual upon whom the neck restraint was applied.
Yes, sir.
And if we could publish Exhibit 110 again, and bringing this specific topic back to the concept of proportionality. Could you enlarge this, please? Do you have one of those stylus up there?
Oh, I guess I do.
You can touch the screen and make a mark here. Unconscious neck restraint. An unconscious neck restraint is when the person would actually be rendered unconscious, correct?
That's correct.
And intentionally so.
Yes, sir.
Could you please underline unconscious neck restraint as you see it in this response and control guide?
Yes, sir.
And what subject activity, what level of subject activity would be required to use an unconscious neck restraint?
Well, according to this chart, it's in the red area, so it would be active aggression.
Okay. And do you agree with that?
Yeah. I think in the last slide we talked about active resistance if other techniques didn't work, but definitely in active aggression is where it's placed.
If we look then, you can also find a conscious neck restraint, and that's the neck restraint that's used for the purpose of control, correct?
Correct.
Could you underline where that is in this force continuum, Exhibit 110? And so the conscious neck restraint is authorized in circumstances where there's, in fact, active resistance. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
So then if there was something like passive resistance, right, neither the conscious neck restraint nor the unconscious neck restraint would be authorized. Is that right?
Would not be authorized?
Would not be
That
authorized.
is correct.
And an unconscious neck restraint would not even be authorized for some forms of active resistance, would it?
That's correct.
And if the subject is offering no resistance, obviously, then no neck restraint would be authorized,
That's correct.
or any restraint, would it?
Or any,
Or any restraint, if there's no.
yeah, generally, no.
Okay. In addition to the classroom training, you actually teach officers, show them physically how to do these sort of neck restraints.
Yes, sir.
At this time, I'd like to republish Exhibit 17. Sir, is this an MPD trained neck restraint?
No, sir.
Has it ever been?
Not to my, neck restraint? No, sir.
Is this a MPD authorized restraint technique?
Knee on the neck would be something that does happen in use of force that isn't unauthorized.
And under what circumstances would that be authorized? How long can you do that?
I don't know if there's a time frame. It would depend on the circumstance of the time,
Which would include what?
the type of resistance you're getting from the subject that you're putting the knee on.
And so if there was, say for example, the subject was under control and handcuffed, would this be authorized?
I would say no.
If you could take that down, please. Continuing in this defensive tactics presentation, if you could go back to Exhibit 119, page 56. You also teach officers the proper handcuffing and techniques, is that right?
Yes, sir.
And according to the handcuffing techniques, they're to be handcuffed behind the back, and the handcuff is to be double locked.
Sure. There's the jury. We're going to take our morning break. Let's reconvene at 11:15. Thank you. Lieutenant, you can step down for now.
Thank you, sir.
Just a reminder, Lieutenant, you're still under oath.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Susher.
Thank you, Your Honor. Sir, when we left off, you were looking at Exhibit 119, page 56, and we were starting to discuss what your training is regarding handcuffing. Could you please explain to the jury how you train Minneapolis police officers in handcuffing techniques in the use of force?
Yes, sir. Well, we teach several different positional handcuffing techniques, as well as how to approach people when they're going to be handcuffed. And then once you make contact with the person, how to properly place the cuffs and procedures after.
How do you properly place the cuffs?
Well, one cuff at a time, and then once they're on and everything's under control in Code 4, as we call it, things have calmed down to the point where you have control of the subject. You want to make sure that you check the fit of the cuffs and double lock them for their safety. They tend to, behind your back, if you sit down, they tend to tighten up on a person. So we want to be mindful of the fit of the handcuffs.
And the double locking prevents the further tightening of the handcuffs?
Yes, sir. The double lock is just a little button that you use your cuff key to push, and it prevents the cuffs from either coming undone or going in.
And there's several different positions that an officer can be in when they're handcuffing a suspect. Is that right?
I'm sorry, can you
The
rephrase
officer could be in many different positions relative to the subject when they're handcuffing them.
that? Absolutely. Very dynamic. Yes, sir.
Standing,
Yes, sir.
prone.
Yes, sir.
Right. And I'd like you to please describe for the jury what techniques are used to prone handcuff a subject.
With prone handcuffing, we want to make sure that we isolate an arm, and a lot of times we teach the officers to use a knee to control their shoulder. Generally, you put one knee on each side of the arm, so one would be on the upper shoulder, one about middle of the back, excuse me, and then isolate that arm, present the wrist for cuffing, and then handcuff. And a lot of times when you're doing the prone cuffing, you do that with a partner preferably. It makes it a lot easier to control a person.
And if someone is handcuffed and you're using your knee on their back or shoulder to gain control, do you leave it there for an extended period of time?
It depends on the circumstance. You can leave it there for a longer period of time depending on the resistance you get.
And what would signal to you as a trainer when you're supposed to release your knee?
When their behavior de-escalates their resistance.
Relative to the handcuffing?
That's correct, sir. Yes.
Yeah,
Compliance.
No. So once you've accomplished the handcuffing, once the subject's actually been handcuffed, is that the appropriate time to release your leg?
Not necessarily.
Why?
When people are handcuffed in the prone position, they can thrash around, writhe around, and they do present a little bit of a threat. They can kick, bite, some other things. So control doesn't end with handcuffing always.
If the subject is resisting, correct?
That's correct.
The mere possibility that it's potential that a subject could resist like that, kicking, is that justification to leave your leg in place?
No, sir. I would say you need behavior that would lead you to leave your knee there.
So once the subject is handcuffed and compliant or not resisting, is the officer to remove their knee?
That would be an appropriate time.
And how long then is the person, the subject, to be left in the prone handcuffed position once they're compliant?
It depends on the circumstances that you're involved in with this person and the surrounding environment.
So assume the circumstances that I just stated. The subject is prone, handcuffed, and no longer resisting.
I think when it's reasonably necessary, you have the time to do it, then you should get them in a different position.
What position is that?
It depends on circumstances, but you can put them in the recovery position on their side. You can sit them up. You can stand them up.
And why would you want to put them into a different position?
There is the possibility and risk that that some people have difficulty breathing when the handcuffs are behind their back and they're on the stomach.
And what is that known as?
I'm sorry, rephrase.
Are you familiar with the phrase positional asphyxia?
Oh, yes, sir.
Is that the danger you would be trying to avoid by putting someone in the side recovery position?
That is one of the dangers you're trying to avoid, yes.
My previous suggestion.
Sustained. Last answer is stricken. Rephrase.
You testified that you're familiar with the term positional asphyxia.
Yes, I am.
Okay. Why would you roll someone into the side recovery position after they've been handcuffed and are compliant?
Several reasons are there, but one would be to prevent a potential situation where they might be subject to positional asphyxiation.
And how soon is a subject to be placed into the side recovery position after they've become compliant and no longer resistant?
When the scene is code for and you are able to do it.
Okay. In terms of subject safety, how soon should the person be put into the side recovery position?
I would say sooner the better.
Now, you testified that there are circumstances in which the subject can offer further resistance even though they're handcuffed. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
I'd like to direct your attention to page 58 of Exhibit 219. This slide discusses the maximal restraint technique. Is that right?
That's correct.
Is there a particular device that's used to accomplish the maximal restraint technique?
Yes, sir. It's the RIP restraint or the RIP hobble.
Okay. Can you please describe the maximal restraint technique to the jury?
Yes, sir. If you have a subject that is handcuffed behind their back, generally, and that's the way we like to handcuff people, and they continue to cause a threat to you or other people or themselves, we have taught our officers to use the maximal restraint technique, which is taking this RIP restraint, which is a nylon strap with a clamp on it, and you would wrap that around their legs and then connect it to the front of the body if possible, like a belt loop or a second restraint around their waist. And what that does is it bends their legs so that their legs are no longer a threat to kick out at you. Kind of put their legs at about a 90-degree angle so they're not able to extend the legs out to kick you if they are a threat.
Are you aware that the use of the maximal restraint technique is guided and governed by MPD policy?
Yes, sir, it is.
And that's 5-316?
That's correct.
All right. Is there more than one device that's authorized to perform the maximal restraint technique?
I believe it right now it's just the RIP or the RIP hobble is the one we use.
And so if an officer reasonably believes that a subject is thrashing, would you recommend that they use this maximal restraint technique to ensure their safety?
Yes, sir.
And if they do so in accordance with MPD policy 5-316 in your training, what does the officer need to do after the subject has been placed in the MRT and is prone?
Place them in the recovery position
How soon?
as soon as possible.
Why?
Because when you further restrict their ability to move, it can further restrict their ability to breathe.
Now, in terms of the appropriateness of force, would you agree with the proposition that force must be reasonable when it's applied?
Yes, sir.
And would you also agree that circumstances can change? Right? Subject behavior can change,
Yes, sir.
right? The environment can change.
Yes, sir.
And you familiar with Minneapolis MPD critical thinking model?
The critical decision-making model?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
And that's kind of a graphic that
Single objections, Your Honor.
I haven't asked the question yet.
Hard not to be leading with that. Let's try and rephrase this.
Is the critical thinking model a graphical representation of a different concept?
I don't know if I understand the question, sir.
Are you familiar with the concept of reassessment?
A reassessment? Absolutely.
Right. And you describe reassessment to the jury.
Yes, sir. Through the critical decision-making model, we've put basically a template together for officers to look at and to understand their thinking processes. And reevaluation is when you're looking at circumstances that you're involved in, and you're constantly looking for factors to change so you can change your behavior.
And is reassessment something that you've been teaching even before the advent of this model?
Oh yes, it's paramount to use of force.
And so there can be a point in time when a particular type of force is reasonable, but as time passes, circumstances can change?
Yes, sir.
And then that force would no longer be reasonable.
That's correct.
And if that's the case, what is the officer to do?
They're to change their force.
Thank you, Your Honor. I have nothing further.
Mr. Nelson.
If I may have just a moment, Your Honor. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
I had to check the time. Thank you for being with us today. I have a few follow-up questions regarding the training the Minneapolis Police Department provides. You testified that one of your specialties, or I believe that you talked about how you developed the ground defense program.
I was one of the people that founded it, yes.
Okay. Can you just describe generally what is the ground defense program?
It's using techniques other than strikes to control individuals. I mean, that's the broad term.
And essentially that was a program that was introduced some 10, 15 years ago to the MPD?
I believe it's 10 years now.
Okay. And that's using different, like jujitsu moves or different body control methods versus punching or striking an individual, right?
That's correct.
And that was a program, again, that you helped develop and found, and you continued to train throughout the Minneapolis Police Department during your time as in the training division, right?
That's correct, sir.
And it's fair to say that when you train a police officer, you're training them in particular moves that will help improve their ability to gain compliance of a subject, right?
That's the goal, yes, sir.
But certainly there's no strict application of every single rule, agreed? Or every single technique.
That is correct.
Officers,
Objection. Which question is it for? Every move or every?
Objection is sustained. Compound question. Rephrase.
Sure.
Answers are stricken.
there is no strict application of every technique that an officer is trained, is there?
No.
Officers are trained to be fluid, correct?
Yes, sir.
And sometimes officers have to do things that are unattractive to other people
Correct.
in terms of the use of force.
Yes, sir.
And an officer, you would agree that being a police officer is a relatively dangerous job?
Yes, sir.
You yourself, in the course of your career, have had to use force against suspects.
Yes, sir.
You've arrested many people, I presume.
Yes, sir.
And would you agree that sometimes people aren't particularly happy about being arrested?
Very rarely, sir.
And sometimes they fight with you,
Yes, sir.
and sometimes they argue with you,
Yes, sir.
sometimes they make excuses.
Yes, sir.
And ultimately, one of the things that a police officer has to do is try to determine, is this person pretending or trying to give me some excuse not to get arrested, or is this person experiencing some other crisis, right?
Yes.
Right? And ultimately, in terms of an arrest, that's one of the things that an officer has to ascertain, right?
Yes, sir.
And again, when you've arrested people, have you had people plead with you not to arrest them?
Yes, sir.
Have you had people say they were having a medical emergency,
Yes, sir.
have you had people say, I can't breathe?
Yes, sir.
And were there circumstances during the course of your career as a patrol officer where you didn't believe that that person was having a medical emergency?
Yes, sir.
And that's all part of the analysis in terms of the use of force, right?
It plays a part, yes, sir.
And so if someone comes to you and says, if you tell someone I'm under arrest, one way that a person can resist arrest is through the use of their words, agreed?
Yes, sir.
And that's a form of what you would call passive resistance.
Depending on the types of words that are used.
Right. So words could be both passive or active resistance, right?
I would say yes.
Right. So the difference between I'm having a heart attack versus screw you, you're not going to take me.
Oh, yeah, yes.
So that's what you mean by the difference in the words, right?
That's correct.
Or if a suspect is threatening you when you're arresting.
That's correct.
All right. Now, the whole concept of this ground defense program, as you testified, was to really use body weight and control to gain compliance of a subject, right?
Yes, sir.
And would you agree that in any use of force situation, the circumstances can change from minute to minute, second to second?
Yes, sir.
So somebody who is initially compliant can suddenly become non-compliant.
That's correct.
Somebody who's peacefully going into custody could suddenly become violent towards an officer.
That's correct.
Somebody who is violent in 1 second, becomes compliant, could become violent again, right?
Yes, sir.
You've experienced that yourself, correct?
I have.
And an officer, in terms of the use of force, you don't train officers specifically to only focus on the individual that they're taking into custody, do you?
No.
Do you train them on officers to consider and to take into consideration other factors,
Yes, sir.
such as their partner's safety,
That's correct.
such as a crowd,
Correct.
such as the difference between a crowd, right? Like,
Yes, sir.
are they a happy crowd or are they an angry crowd?
Yes, sir.
In terms of, we talked about the proportionality of the use of force and kind of sliding force up and down that model. Do you recall that?
Yes, sir.
When an officer uses force, do you train officers to take into consideration what happened immediately prior to the use of a particular use of force?
Could you rephrase that, sir? I'm sorry.
Sure. In terms of the continuation of the use of force, do you train officers to take into consideration what has happened with that suspect in the immediate preceding events?
Yes, sir.
So, for example, if you were just fighting with a suspect and that person becomes compliant, does that become a consideration in terms of a continued use of force?
Yes, sir.
If someone has a sizable or a large size difference, do you train officers to take that into consideration in terms of their use of force?
Yes, sir.
So if some person had fought with more than one officer at a time, do you train officers to take that into consideration as far as the continuing use of force?
Yes, sir.
So one person against 3 people is a factor that officers would consider for the continued use of force.
Yes, sir.
Do you train officers relevant to the use of force for people who are under the influence of controlled substances?
It's a consideration, yes.
And in your experience, have you ever had to use force against somebody who's under the influence of a controlled substance?
Yes, sir.
Do you train officers that certain controlled substances can cause a person to exhibit more strength than they would have otherwise?
Yes, sir.
So going back to the ground defense program, the ground defense program really uses a lot of joint manipulations, correct?
Yes, sir.
Pressure points,
Not so much pressure points with ground control.
okay. Body weight pins.
Yes, sir.
Using the officer's body weight to physically control an individual, correct?
Yes, sir.
Now, you were previously interviewed by the FBI in connection with this case,
Yes, sir.
and you are aware that your statement was recorded, transcribed, and were you aware of that?
I was aware of that.
Have you had an opportunity to review your statement to the FBI?
Nope.
Okay. So I'm going to ask you just some general questions, and if I need to refresh your recollection, I'll do so, okay?
Okay, thank you.
So, in terms of Minneapolis Police Department policy, there's a difference between a chokehold and a neck restraint, correct?
That's correct.
A chokehold is considered a lethal or deadly use of force, correct?
Correct.
And a chokehold is defined by Minneapolis policy as specifically blocking the trachea or the airway of the suspect from the front side, correct?
Correct.
So essentially what you would kind of think of as almost strangulation, putting your hands around someone's neck and squeezing the front of their neck, correct?
Yes, sir.
In this particular case, have you had an opportunity to review the body-worn cameras, the bystander surveillance, or the bystander cameras?
I have seen both, sir.
Okay. At any point, did you see Officer Chauvin use a choke hold in this case?
No, sir.
Now, in terms of neck restraints, you testified that you have been involved in the martial arts since college,
Yes, sir.
and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that you also train MMA fighting.
No, sir, I do not.
Have you ever?
No, sir.
But in the course of your training, both in martial arts as well as like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and your training to become a use of force instructor, you have experienced neck restraints, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you have taught individual officers, I believe you say hundreds of times, and hundreds of officers on how to use a neck restraint, correct?
Yes, sir.
And a neck restraint, as you have described it, requires both sides of the neck to be compressed in order to render a person unconscious, correct?
That is what we teach, yes.
How much pressure has to be applied to both sides of the neck in order to render a person unconscious based on your training?
It depends.
Okay. On what factors?
Size of the person, your skill, whether they're on narcotics or not, whether they're having an adrenaline rush, heart rate, general physical health. There's just a lot of factors involved.
Okay. Typically, do you have to apply a lot of pressure to, let's say, a healthy individual for a long period of time in order to render someone unconscious?
I would say no.
Right. Do you recall what is the percentage of pressure that you would generally expect to have to apply?
I don't know if I can.
Objection vague.
Overruled.
Question again, sir?
What amount of pressure do you have to apply typically in order to render someone unconscious?
I don't know if I can answer that. It's very individual.
Okay. So you said factors such as controlled substance use play into it, correct?
Yes, sir.
And if a suspect is on a controlled substance, does that speed up the process of rendering someone unconscious or slow it down?
I think my experiences are that it speeds it up.
And if someone you said another factor is if someone has an adrenaline surge, right?
Yes, sir.
And if someone has an adrenaline surge coursing through their body, does a use of a neck restraint speed up or slow, or does that adrenaline speed up or slow down the unconsciousness?
Objection, Your Honor. This is beyond his base of knowledge and scope of direction.
Any more foundation?
Your Honor, I can refresh his recollection with his statement if that recalls.
Look, Your Honor, do we have a sidebar?
No. Proceed.
would it refresh your recollection to review your statement relevant to adrenaline and the impact of how it speeds up or slows down a neck restraint?
I don't believe I need to see that.
Okay.
I know the answer.
What's the answer?
The answer is the higher your blood rate or your respiration and heart rate is, generally the faster a neck restraint affects somebody.
And how long, based on your training and experience, does it typically take to render a person unconscious using a neck restraint?
My experience is under 10 seconds.
Under 10 seconds?
Yes, sir.
Now, when a neck restraint is applied, does the Minneapolis Police Department specifically train people to be cautious when reviving or attempting to revive a suspect?
I'm not sure I understand the question, sir.
In your experience, after a person has been rendered unconscious using a neck restraint, is it possible for them to continue to fight after they come back to consciousness?
It is possible, yes.
Have you experienced that personally?
I have not experienced somebody fighting after a neck restraint.
Okay. But you're aware the Minneapolis Police Department trains people that is a possibility.
Yes, sir.
And in fact, sometimes they can be just as aggressive or even more aggressive after coming to consciousness.
That is possible, yes.
Now, in terms of the use of a neck restraint specifically, there are circumstances, are there not, where an officer can continue to hold a person in a neck restraint after rendering someone unconscious?
Hold somebody? Yes.
And for a period of time, correct?
Yes, sir. You can have your arm around their neck for a period of time, yes.
And there would be circumstances that would affect an officer's decision on whether to hold that person in that position for some period of time, correct?
Yes, sir.
That would include maybe waiting for other officers to arrive,
Yes, sir.
waiting for EMS to arrive.
I don't know about that. I wouldn't go that far, no.
Okay. You also train in the training department officers on what are called the human factors of force, correct?
Yes, sir.
And generally, can you describe what the human factors of force are?
Yes, sir. It involves either a startle response to the officer or getting scared or having an adrenaline rush or adrenaline dump in their body. And it affects your cognitive, physical abilities when you encounter stress like that.
So it's fair to say that when an officer is engaged in a use of force incident, him or herself, they may experience a rush of adrenaline as well, right?
Yes, sir.
You've experienced that yourself?
Yes, sir.
And after a situation has calmed down to some degree, the officer experiences an adrenaline rush, or dump, excuse me.
The adrenaline can continue to course through the body, yes.
And at some point it leaves.
Yes, sir.
And that adrenaline, officers are trained on this, correct?
Yes, sir.
It's a part of the standard training for both recruit officers in the academy as well as veteran officers in their in-service.
That's correct.
How frequently is the human factors of force taught to police officers?
I believe we teach it about once a year. We discuss the human factors of force.
You also train officers to be very much aware of their surroundings at all time, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you were asked a series of questions about continuing to hold someone in a prone position, and you use the term, you could hold them there until the scene is code 4. Do you recall that?
Yes, sir.
And so it's fair to say that the Minneapolis Police Department would train officers under certain circumstances to hold a person in a prone position until the scene is safe, correct?
There are circumstances where that is appropriate, yes.
And some of those circumstances could be the reaction of bystanders, correct?
That may be a factor, yes.
It could include where you are physically located in terms of a geographical area, correct?
Yes.
Right. Where you are in terms of other hazards that may present themselves to an officer or to the suspect, right?
Yes, sir.
Being in a busy street, in the middle of a busy street, versus being in a park or a yard or something.
Yes, sir.
Now, you also described the Minneapolis Police Department's policy in terms of rendering medical aid as best you can, right?
Yes.
An officer is required to do that, correct?
Yes, sir.
But there are certain circumstances, correct me if I'm wrong, where an officer has to consider whether it's safe for the officer to do so, correct?
Yes, sir.
And in fact, the training that Minneapolis police officers receive requires it to be safe for an officer to render medical aid. Agreed?
Generally, yes.
And one of the considerations an officer has to make in determining whether to render medical aid is whether or not the suspect is cuffed or uncuffed, right?
That may be a factor, yes.
There are circumstances where you've been fighting with a person and you've gotten them handcuffed, and you have to decide, is it worth the risk to take these handcuffs off to give this person medical aid?
Yes, sir.
Because once you unhandcuff a suspect, they could become resistant again, correct?
That is correct.
You have to decide, is that a risk you're willing to take?
Yes, sir.
You also described the recovery position, correct?
Yes, sir.
And the recovery position could be rolling someone on their side, sitting them up, or standing them up, right?
Yes, sir.
And again, there would be circumstances, you can envision circumstances where you would not put a person into the recovery position, correct?
Yes, sir.
And again, all of those factors that we've kind of talked about in terms of partner safety, personal safety, safety of the subject, safety of the crowd, all of those things are going through that critical decision-making model process, right?
Yes, sir.
Now, in terms of the use of body weight to hold a suspect, right? You train officers to use their knee across the back, shoulder, or the shoulder to the base of the neck of a subject, correct?
Yes.
That is something that is specifically trained by the Minneapolis Police Department, whether it be for handcuffing purposes or simply prone control of a subject.
Yes, sir.
So if a person is being handcuffed, officers are specifically trained to put a knee across the shoulder blade of the suspect to the trapezius, is that what it's called?
Yeah, trapezoid, yeah.
Something,
Yeah, sure. I'm not a medical doctor. So.
yeah. And that is routinely trained by the Minneapolis Police Department, both in terms of the academy as well as in service.
Situationally, yes.
And simply because a person is handcuffed, there would be other circumstances where you would use that body weight, that prone control technique to maintain control of a subject, correct?
Yes.
And in terms of we could publish Exhibit 17 here. If we could publish Exhibit 17. You were asked a series of questions about whether this is appears to be a trained Minneapolis neck restraint.
Yes, I was asked that.
And you said no,
No.
correct?
Correct.
But it is, you had hedged a little bit and said it may be some other training.
Perhaps.
What would that training be?
Using body weight to control. However, I will add that we tell officers to stay away from the neck when possible, and if you're going to use body weight to pin, to put it on their shoulder and be mindful of position.
All right. If we can take this down, and just to the witness, I'd like to display a couple of. This is page 41 of Exhibit 126. Just show this to the witness. Can you see that, sir?
Not yet.
Oh, sorry. Oop, this is already in evidence, but in this bottom corner here,
Yes.
do you see a photograph of an individual demonstrating how to handcuff a person?
Yes, sir.
And that knee is across the neck of that individual, correct?
The knee is on his far shoulder.
Across the neck, the base of the neck.
The shin would be from his toes up to the knee. Yes, the shin is across the back of the neck.
So that's when we're talking about prone handcuffing. This is a specific kind of photograph that demonstrates the placement of a knee as it applies to prone handcuffing, correct?
Correct.
And ultimately, if that person were to be handcuffed and circumstances dictated, the officer would be permitted to continue to hold his knee in that same position. Agreed?
I would say yes. However, we've cautioned officers that be mindful of the neck area and to look for the shoulder for placement.
Perfect. We can take this down. Can we take that down, Your Honor? I'm going to show you what has been introduced as Exhibit 56 already. Can you see that, sir?
A little glare, but yes, sir.
It appears to be the
Sure. Yes, sir.
it appears to be the paramedic checking the carotid pulse of Mr. Floyd.
Yes, sir.
In your experience, this is already admitted as Exhibit 56. In your experience, would you be able to touch the carotid artery if the knee was placed on the carotid artery?
No, sir.
Sir, I'm showing you what's been marked for identification purposes as Exhibit 1045, 1045. Can you just generally take a look at that?
Yes, sir.
Now, in terms of, do you recognize that this appears to be a still photograph taken from the body-worn camera of one of the involved officers?
That's what it appears to be, yes.
There's a timestamp on it that indicates May 25th, 2020 at 20:23:32.
Yes, sir.
And can you see two officers in this area here holding Mr. Floyd?
Yes, sir.
And if I can clear this. Here, does that appear to be the placement of one officer's knee and leg?
Yes, sir.
Does that appear to be across the shoulder blade to the base of the neck?
The shin appears to be across the shoulder blade. I don't know if I can tell you where the knee is.
So we'll just, I would offer 1045.
Any objection?
Foundationally, Your Honor, could you identify which officer?
Officer King.
No objection, Your Honor.
All right, 1045 is received.
Permission to publish. Could we clear that? Oh, okay. So what we're seeing here, again, this is at 8:23 and 32 seconds, correct?
Yes, sir.
And obviously, this is taken from one of the body cameras, and here you can see down in that area the leg placement of the officer, correct?
Yes, sir.
And based on your observation of this photograph, it appears that the shin is coming from the top of the shoulder across the shoulder blade, correct?
Yes, sir.
And it appears to be at an angle pointed in towards the squad car, correct?
Yes, sir.
All right. If we could take this down, Your Honor. Sorry, I'm missing. I think I accidentally closed. Hang on one second. Sure, I'm showing you what's been marked for identification purposes as 1046. Does that appear to be a similar angle?
Yes, sir.
And I apologize, it was actually Officer Lane's body-worn camera.
On 1045?
1045 and 1046. Again, can you see what appears to be the placement of the leg of one of the officers at the shoulder blade of Mr. Floyd?
It appears so.
You can see in this area here what appears to be the back or the calf area coming across the shoulder blade, correct?
Yes, sir.
Again, the time stamp is 10:26 and 40 seconds.
Yes, sir.
And does that knee placement appear to be similar to how a Minneapolis, or excuse me, similar to the placement in the previous exhibit?
The last exhibit, sir?
Yes.
Yes.
And that was roughly a couple of minutes after, right?
Yes, sir.
I would offer exhibit 1046.
Just for clarification, did you say 10:26 and 46 seconds? Or do you need
8:26 and 40 seconds. 20, 26, 40.
No objection.
1046 is received.
Permission to publish. So again, it's a little hard to see in this particular photograph, but if we look in this general area here, correct? You can see the placement of the knee, correct?
I can see the general area of the placement of the knee, yes.
And again, here we have what appears to be the shin coming over the top of Mr. Floyd's shoulder blade,
That's what it appears, sir.
and that would be angled in towards the squad car, correct?
Correct.
You take that down, Your Honor. Sir, I'm showing you what's been marked for identification purposes as Exhibit 1047. Does that also appear to be a still frame image taken from a body-worn camera of a Minneapolis police officer?
Yes, sir.
Timestamp being 8:27 and 49 seconds,
Yes, sir.
20:27:49, correct?
Correct.
And it appears that the officer wearing this body-worn camera has now stood up, correct?
It's a different angle, sir, yes.
From higher to lower, correct?
Lower to higher, sir?
It appears that the camera is at a higher angle, looking down.
Yes, sir.
And can you see in this photograph what appears to be the knee and shin placement of the officer?
Yes, sir.
And would you agree that it appears that the knee is placed in the center between Mr. Floyd's shoulder blades?
It appears to be between his shoulder blades, sir, yes.
I'd offer 1047.
Any objection?
Lane,
No objection, Your
1047 is received.
permission to publish. So again, here in this particular photograph, you can see the placement of Mr. Chauvin's knee in between the shoulder blades of Mr. Floyd, correct?
Yes, sir.
All right. And it happens to be right here, that moment when the carotid artery is being palpated by the EMT.
Yes, sir.
We could take this down. Let me show you one last photograph, sir. Again, does this appear to be a photograph taken from, or a still frame image of a Minneapolis police body camera?
Yes, sir.
Time being 10, 28, and 29 seconds.
Yes, sir.
Excuse me, 20, 28, 29,
20, 28, 29, sir, yes.
which would be 8, 28, 29.
Correct.
And again, can you see the placement of Officer Chauvin's knee?
Yes, sir.
Can you see Mr. Floyd's head?
Yes, sir.
I'd offer 1048.
Any objection?
Yes, they're all made.
No objection.
1048 is received.
Permission to publish. And again, it's a little hard to see here, but you can see Mr. Floyd's head in that area,
Yes, sir.
and Mr. Chauvin, Officer Chauvin's knee between the shoulder blades of Mr. Floyd.
Yes, sir.
Does this appear to be a neck restraint?
No, sir.
Does this appear to be a prone hold that an officer may apply with his knee?
Yes.
We can take that down here. Now, you have talked about taking or holding a person in the prone position after they have stopped resisting. Do you recall talking about that?
Yes, sir.
And are there circumstances in your career where you have had to use your body weight to hold a suspect down for longer periods of time than, say, 2 or 3 seconds?
Yes, sir.
And are there times where you have had to use your body weight to hold a suspect down for 10 minutes?
I'm not sure if I have held somebody down for 10 minutes or not. I don't have a recollection of that, sir.
Is it possible?
Yes, it's possible.
And there are circumstances, again, that an officer has to take into consideration in terms of continuing to use their body weight regardless of whether the person is resisting or not resisting, right?
Rephrase that?
Sure. Sometimes an officer has called for EMS, correct?
That's correct.
And sometimes an officer may hold a person using their body weight to restrain them, awaiting the arrival of EMS, correct?
Yes, sir.
You've done that yourself?
I have.
And sometimes you've had to, or was it fair to say that you've had to train officers to use their body weight to continue holding them until EMS arrives?
As long as needed to control them, yes.
You would agree that a scene where force has been used and a crowd congregates and is voicing their displeasure or their concern or whatever you want to say, that can be a chaotic situation for an officer, right?
Yes, sir.
And you would agree also that what you train Minneapolis police officers to do, relevant to their use of force, is to consider the totality of the circumstances. Agreed?
Yes, sir.
And you train officers that the decision to use force is from their perspective,
Yes, sir.
not the perspective, hindsight being 20/20.
That's correct.
That's the specific policy of Minneapolis Police Department.
I believe that's Graham versus Connor, sir.
That is encapsulated or incorporated into the Minneapolis Police Department policy on the use of force, correct?
Correct.
Because situations are rapidly evolving, correct?
That's correct.
And sometimes just because an incident is 10 minutes long or 20 minutes long, that doesn't mean that it can't instantaneously change.
That's correct.
Right? What may not be a threat 1 second can be a threat the next.
Correct.
Have you ever been trained or trained others to say that if a person can talk, they can breathe?
It's been said, yes.
In terms of the continuation of the use of force, right? Or excuse me, not the use of the continuation. The graphic that we looked at in Exhibit 110. If we could just publish Exhibit 110, Your Honor. This is the Defense Control and Response Training Guide, correct?
That's correct.
Simply because a person is not actively resisting, right? That doesn't mean you can't use some degree of force, correct?
That's correct.
If a person is passively resisting, you can still use certain types of force, right?
Yes, sir.
That's down in this area here, correct?
Correct.
And that would include the use of joint manipulation, escort holds, pressure points, correct?
Yes, sir.
We could take that down here. Sorry, we could take it down. You were asked a series of questions about the strike chart and the neck, you know, the red, yellow, and green zones.
Yeah, it's called the Monadnock chart, sir. Yes, for
What-
striking.
That chart is designed specifically for punches, baton strikes, things of that nature, correct?
That's where we use that graph, yes.
In terms of the maximal restraint technique, you were describing the use of the maximal restraint technique.
Yes, sir.
And again, officers are trained to sometimes escalate the use of force in certain circumstances, correct?
Yes.
And de-escalate the use of force in certain circumstances.
Yes, sir.
If an officer decides initially to use the maximal restraint technique and then subsequently decides against it because of a medical situation or because of a lack of resistance, or would that be a de-escalation of the use of force?
Yes.
Is it more or less difficult to render medical aid if someone is in the maximal restraint technique?
I would say it was probably a little bit more difficult to maneuver around that.
You would not be able to put them on their back, for example.
It would be difficult, so yes.
In terms of the use of force, part of the ground defense program is actually to use body weight as a form of de-escalation, is it not?
Yeah, it's use of force that may be used instead of higher escalations of force, yes.
But sometimes holding someone in a position can be a de-escalating technique.
Yes, sir.
And ultimately, again, in terms of the use of force and deciding how much force should be used, the difference in size of an officer to a subject is a consideration,
It is a consideration, yes.
as well as the presence of other officers, right?
Yes, sir.
You would agree that basically the use of force in any circumstance is incredibly dependent upon the situation.
Yes, sir.
And when an officer is using force, they are to employ the critical decision-making model, correct?
They should be using that at all times.
But including the use of force.
Yes, sir.
And that critical decision-making model is not simply focused exclusively on the subject of the force being used, correct?
It's a situational awareness tool.
And the situational awareness extends beyond just the subject.
That's correct.
It extends to numerous factors.
Correct.
I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Mr. Swisher.
Thank you, Your Honor. Sir, to follow up on some questions that counsel is asking you regarding the use of force being reasonable in the eyes of the officer. That's what you answer the training is that right?
At the officer involved at the moment the force is used, yes.
But force is always subject to review, correct?
Yes, sir.
And review is always going to be after the fact, right?
That's correct.
And the force that's used and reviewed must be reasonable,
That's correct.
taken from that perspective, the perspective of the officer at the time, correct?
That's correct.
But the officer doesn't have the unfettered discretion to use whatever force they wish.
No, they do not, sir.
Now, if we could take publish the Exhibit 110 again, which is the control guide continuum. Now, when we look over here on the left-hand side and we're talking about what force can be used and what's proportional, we see that the officer is to look at the subject behavior. Is that right?
For force on the subject, yes, sir.
And the amount of force that they use that's proportionate has to be proportionate to the subject's behavior, correct?
Generally speaking, yes.
So if, for example, a group of bystanders were doing something that the officer might find annoying, such as videotaping, right? That act would not be subject-controlled behavior, would it?
No, sir.
And that act would not justify the use of force or escalation of force by the officer, would it?
That alone, sir, no.
Because that's not subject-controlled behavior, correct?
Correct.
So if we could then publish Exhibit 184. Exhibit 184 has been received into evidence, and what you see here is a group of bystanders. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And in a couple of instances, you can see the bystanders have something in their hands, correct?
Yes, sir.
And those appear to be video cameras. Is that right? Or smartphones.
Yes, sir.
That extra fact would not justify an increased use of force, would it?
Just the camera, sir? No.
If you could take down Exhibit 184. The acceptable use of a knee across a subject's back, it's a transitory position, is that right?
Yes, it is.
It's meant to be used to gain control of the subject while the subject is being handcuffed.
Correct.
But all force must end at some point, is that right?
That is correct.
And once a subject is under control and no longer resistant, it's inappropriate to hold them in a position where you're draping your knee across their back or neck, isn't it?
I would say it's time to de-escalate force, sir.
And get off of them.
Yes, sir.
You talked about the prone position in and of itself being something that can lead to positional asphyxia, is that right?
Yes, sir.
Would that risk be increased by the addition of body weight?
Yes, sir.
And so if an officer was placing body weight on the knee, with the knee on the neck or the back, or the neck and the back, that would transfer the officer's body weight onto the person, correct?
Yes, sir.
And that would increase the restriction, I guess, decrease the ability of the subject to breathe. Is that right?
Potentially, sir, yes.
And it would not be, or I have to ask you, would that be appropriate to hold someone in a position where it's more difficult to breathe for an extended period of time after the subject has stopped offering resistance?
Can you rephrase that, sir?
Would it be appropriate and within training to hold a subject in that prone restrained position with a knee on the neck and a knee on the back for an extended period of time after the subject has stopped offering any resistance?
No, sir.
Or has lost their pulse?
No, sir.
You testified that an individual can be unconscious one moment and then suddenly become conscious and become violent, correct?
That is potentially, yes, sir.
Have you ever had a circumstance where an individual has lost their pulse and suddenly come back to life and become more violent?
Not that I'm aware of, sir.
Nothing further.
Any further requests?
Sir, in terms of the use of force and the continuation of the use of force, you were just shown Exhibit 184. I'm going to ask to republish 184. Looking at this individual right here, does it appear that the man in blue is holding back the man in black?
Yes, sir. The guy with the boxing shirt on?
Yes.
Sir. He's holding back. That's at a glance.
Yep. Now, in terms of the continuation of use of force, and we're talking about involvement of onlookers, right? The words they use matter, correct?
Yes, sir, they do.
If they're cheering on and saying, "Good job, officer," that's one consideration, right?
Correct.
But if they're saying, "I'd slap the fuck out of you," or "You're a pussy," or "You're a chump," would that reasonably tend to rise alarm in a police officer?
Yes, sir.
I have no further questions.
And if they're saying, "Get off him, you're killing him," should the officer also take that into account and consider whether their actions need to be reassessed?
Potentially, sir, yes.
Nothing further.
Thank you, Lieutenant.
Thank you, sir.
You're
Your Honor.
excused.
Appreciate that.
Members of the jury, we're going to take our noon recess. I have 2 meetings, so we won't be able to reconvene until 1:30. Thank you.